Hello to our audience. Welcome. My name is Brandis Friedman, and I am co-anchor and correspondent for Chicago Tonight and host of Chicago Tonight Black Voices, both on Chicago's PBS affiliate, WTTW Channel 11. Before we get started, by means of a disclaimer, please note that the Council is an independent, nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals appearing on the program are their own, and they don't represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Also, if you'd like to ask a question, we'd love to hear it. We'll be taking audience questions in about 30 minutes or so. That's at ccga.live. So just go to your browser, you enter ccga.live, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question there. I will pose it to Evan during the conversation. With that said, let's introduce Evan Osnos. I don't think I need to because all of you are here, so you probably know who he is. But of course, he is the author of a brand new biography on President-elect Joe Biden entitled Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. Copies are available for sale from the Council's local Chicago book partner, The Bookseller. The direct link for purchases is also available on the event webpage and will also be circulated within the Zoom chat function throughout the program. So all of that said, Evan, what do you say we get started?
That sounds great. And it's good. You thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. This is exciting. I'd like to talk about some current affairs first, if we can. Reaction to the president not being seen a whole lot since the election. There was Veterans Day, and he spoke a bit from the White House about, I think, the vaccine or the pandemic response. Otherwise, we haven't seen him a whole lot. The light is going off in my office. What's your reaction to that?
Look, we are living in a very strange phase right now, kind of interregnum in our ordinary politicals calendar. There are certain things that we come to expect around a transition, and what you see is that one part of the transition is moving along and the other part is not. I think, in a way, what's interesting to me is partly that when I was talking to Biden advisors in the days before the election, and they were reasonably precise in predicting how they thought Donald Trump would experience this moment and how he would handle it. And what they said was, look, our strategy is that we're going to move ahead as the law allows, as the vote count allows. And we're not going to allow ourselves to get drawn into, as they put it, a kind of psychodrama generated by the president, because they had every expectation that he would try to shift the attention away from the incoming president to try to maximize the value of these outgoing moments. And so they have tried to keep a focus on the issues. You see them holding these events, essentially holding panel discussions with topic experts on COVID, on national security. And they're trying to, in effect, sequester the president within his own, let's call it what it is right now, a fantasy of maintaining his presidency after the point at which the votes are clear. So I think in a way I'm watching what he's doing, but I'm watching it a lot less than I was before election day.
Okay. He's also done a couple of things. For example, cutting the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan in half just before the next president is inaugurated. Is that a military diplomacy move, or is that a political move? And if it's political, what is he gaining from that?
There's a level of improvisation that we're seeing right now, which is perplexing. Ordinarily, at a moment like this, if you look at the final weeks of the George W. Bush administration or of the Obama administration, you see this very active effort to try to seamlessly merge these two administrations so that there are not exactly big new issues on the horizon that an incoming administration has to deal with. Some of this is speculative right now about what the motive is. I mean, there was a quote in the paper today about the idea that this was somebody in the administration purportedly being quoted as saying that we're lighting fires all over the place and it'll be hard for the Biden administration to put them out. It's very hard to read what this is. There's an element here when we look at the Pentagon and the staff shuffling at the top, some of that appears to be about personal pique and the idea of removing staff who were perceived to be not sufficiently loyal to the outgoing president. And I think there is a personal element of this, which we, of course, recognize from the rest of the last 3.5 years. But it is a distraction, and unfortunately, a dangerous distraction. I call our attention to one of the lessons that came out of the 9/11 Commission report, which, after all, told us in crystal clear terms that this is a fragile seam in American security, these moments, and that what we really should be doing is accelerating the process of transition, getting people into their jobs, getting them into the chair, get their background checks done. And in fact, we're seeing the very opposite of that. And that should worry us as people who pay attention to foreign affairs and national security.
Yeah, that was actually like next on my list of questions is, the 9/11 Commission pointed out that like not having those national security advisors in their positions sooner hurt national security a bit, and kind of this moment and this, failure to participate in the transition could affect U.S. security.
It does. And you know what's interesting, Brandis? I think of one of the pieces of work that the Chicago Council has done consistently over the years that I always look forward to is essentially the measures of perceptions of the United States around the world. How are we regarded? And what we're seeing right now is we're seeing the makings of next year's survey, and it's not going to be flattering. I mean, what we're projecting out into the world is the sense that some of the elements of our most recognizable political character, the idea that we have an orderly transfer of power every 4 or 8 years, that we are doing violence to that reputation. And it's very hard to recover that. And, I think that all of us know folks who are on opposite sides of this political divide right now. And sometimes what people will say to me about President Trump, if they're fans of his, is, look, none of this should be a surprise. We expected this. But I think there's actually a bit of a danger in chalking everything up to sort of the predictable outcome of his behavior and his character. The reality is that doesn't camouflage what is real harm to America's national security and its standing around the world. And the assets that we've accumulated over the course of some hard-won decades of work in building our reputation, things like trust, credibility, reliability, these are very easy to undo and very hard to build back up.
So transitioning a bit to Joe Biden and obviously the book, I want to start with sort of a broad question. He's been in Washington a long time. He started young. He was 29 when he got elected, and a couple of weeks later turned 30, so that he was old enough to actually be the senator that he had just been elected as. He's a bit older now. Why do you think he's lasted so long?
My book, I can tell you, is I'm blowing the lid off the fact that he's 77. But sorry, go on, Brandon.
Yeah, his birthday is actually tomorrow, isn't it?
True.
So no, I was just asking, why do you think he's lasted so long?
Well, it's a fascinating question because in a way, 48 years ago this month, he was elected to the Senate. And what you discover is that there is in his life a couple of important phases. And I think one of the mistakes that we sometimes make is that we assign him to this character thumbnail that was him 25 years ago, or even him 15 years ago. And we do that with a lot of our public figures, but it matters understanding some of the differences in how he thinks and how he operates today, what drives him. When he got into politics in 1972, when he ran for the Senate and took his seat in 73, the truth was he was driven, if I'm being perfectly candid, by a kind of, I would say, a proportion of motives that were about 80% ambition and 20% content. He was opposed to the war in Vietnam. He was, in a general sense, in favor of desegregation, and he believed in the civil rights movement. But as we then saw later, he was an opponent of court-ordered busing. And so he had this kind of somewhat, we could say, kind of malleable political character at that point. And this was partly a reflection of where he was coming from. He was coming from Delaware, which was kind of this strange place politically. It had elements of the North and elements of the South. And he was constantly trying to meet these different pieces of his constituency. And then you see this different person, actually. I'm really struck by the way that he has changed since going into government with President Obama. Because, in a way, that moment, that juncture in his career, it changed how he saw himself, because all of a sudden he saw that these elements that were part of his character that he never realized would be essential to a president became useful. Things like his familiarity with foreign affairs, the fact that he could go around the world and sort of be comfortable in all these places because he'd been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. President Obama didn't have that level of experience abroad. The other difference was, look, Joe Biden loved Congress. He loved being in Congress. He actually held on to his gym, his locker in the gym at the Senate, even after he went into the vice presidency. President Obama, as we know, as he's described himself quite eloquently, really didn't love the experience of being there. He found it frustrating to be in the Senate. He was kind of amazed at how confining it actually was. But I think the experience of working together, it changed Biden a bit because he took real pride in having been as he put it, a kind of faithful servant to a history-making president. And he really thought that one of the things he had done was help Barack Obama succeed. And in a way, I think it kind of elevated Biden in his own self-narrative, that he felt like, all right, I'm not just another member of the Senate, a kind of master legislator. I'm somebody who is trying to nudge American history forward in some way. And you see that, I think, carried through in some of the choices that he's made, particularly around the vice presidency and wanting to bring Kamala Harris's perspective into the White House in a big way.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, and based on what I've read that you've written, of course, that, it could be attributable to his ability to sort of shift and change a bit over these 40 years and to be flexible, not flip-flop, but to be willing to change as needed over those 40 years.
And you get to a really important point. I think, Brandis, this is as much about how we talk about politics in our business as it also is about, the man himself. Look, we as a culture, we have this tendency where we will punish people for flip-flopping on an issue, for changing their mind. And sometimes that's totally valid. Look, if somebody is being opportunistic, if they're advocating for one thing on Monday and then by, a week later, they suddenly have a rapid evolution in their thinking, that should help us understand some of their political flaws. And then there's a different thing, which is that over the course of a life, if somebody is actually being responsive to the changing electorate and responsive to the country, well, then we should hope that they are moving. Because if you take as an example, gay marriage is a pretty good example. Joe Biden for a long time, like the Democratic Party, was opposed to the idea of gay marriage. And then as he saw where things were going, he was personally changing on the subject. And as somebody said to me, and I quoted in the book, somebody worked very closely with him and with President Obama in the White House. They said, in the end, Joe Biden is a perfect weather vane for where the center of the Democratic Party is. And the center moves, and he moves with it. And, he's unlikely to be at the kind of moral vanguard of the party, and he's also unlikely to be trailing with the caboose. He's usually somewhere in between. And I had an interesting conversation, actually, it's worth mentioning, with Cornell William Brooks, who was head of the NAACP. And of course, he is from South Carolina, and he was helping me think through why it was that Biden's candidacy was really sort of changed by South Carolina. It was saved. But he also made the point, he said, look, a lot of my young progressive colleagues have a lot of critiques of Joe Biden. This is no great secret. And what I often will say is, look, you are right to criticize him about features of his legislative record, and we can talk about that. But if you're going to do that, you also have to criticize the Democratic Party, because in many ways, he is a reflection of where the party has moved. And, to state the obvious, Reverend Brooks is a member of the party, but the party has gone through this passage over the course of the last 5 decades. And Joe Biden is a part of that and an illustration of that.
When he ran, he was, like we said, he was 29, just before turning 30. In that campaign, he used his opponent's age against him a little bit, saying, accusing the old guard of bungling things. Now he's going to be the oldest president to take office. It took him some time to get from there to here. And you also write about how he told his first wife's mother that he was going to be president of the United States. And it took him a little while. So it seems like there's a little bit of irony there that he used his age or used his opponent's age against him at the time. But what was he like in his early career?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, in so many ways, Joe Biden decided that he wanted to be in politics at a really young age. And it was very much a reflection of his own experience. Remember, he'd had that really crippling stutter. I think sometimes we underplay what the imprint was on him psychologically, but I've talked to him about it in enough detail to get a feel for what it really meant to him. Look, he can tell you today at the age of, as of tomorrow, 78, he can give you the names of the kids who made fun of him in grade school. It really did have an imprint on him. As he said to me, look, I was known as Joe Impedimenta because I had an impediment. I couldn't talk. And he then broke the back of this thing by basically, reciting the Declaration of Independence and learning Irish poetry and telling it and that kind of experience gave him it was sort of like a slingshot effect where he suddenly found himself extra confident, almost sort of preternaturally ambitious about his ability to talk his way through things and to get people to respond to him. And he just became enamored of the experience of watching the effect on a crowd, of having a conversation with people. And he would zero in on somebody who he knew was a skeptic, and he would work on that person in the crowd. And that then carried him into his first Senate race. And it was a kind of ludicrously ambitious thing to do. He was running against Caleb Boggs, who was this giant of Delaware politics. He'd held every major office in the state, World War II veteran. And Biden, and it really was a kind of family affair. His late wife, Amelia Hunter, and his sister Val was the campaign manager, and his brothers were raising money. And they went around and they ended up winning by this tiny margin. It was one of the biggest upsets in Senate history. And he did exactly as you say, Brandis. He ran as saying, "I'm the voice of a new generation." His ad said, "I know what's happening," or "He knows what's happening now." But what struck me was a very interesting detail, which is that there was a moment on the debate stage when there was a fact, a kind of esoteric fact of foreign policy that his opponent, Caleb Boggs, didn't know the answer to. And the moderator gave Biden the opportunity to kind of run his sword through his opponent and answer the question if he wanted to. Biden did know the answer, and he didn't say it. He didn't offer it. He kind of dodged. He said, "Well, there are details that not all of us will know every day." And he wrote later, and he talked about it, that he said, "Look, the reality was I realized that nobody wanted to see Caleb Boggs humiliated on that debate stage. Nobody wanted to see that. That's not how politics needs to be." And I think there's a deeper lesson in that, which is his sense that it doesn't need to be blood sport. Even when you're in this moment of a kind of generational clash, which is partly what was happening in 1972, and let's be honest, that's what's happening now too, to some degree in our politics, that it need not be blood sport. And I think that's a theme that then carries over the decades in his life.
So, and then I want to get to, I've got one more question, and then I want to get to a little bit more of his time in the Obama administration. But early on in his career, in the current race, not his career, but early on in the current race, his future vice president, Kamala Harris, would call him out on the debate stage. I do get paid to talk. For his opposition to busing Black kids to white schools in his early days. Why did he oppose it?
Well, in a way, this was, I think, an example of him trying to be everything to everyone. At the time, he was from this district that was a mix. There were parts of the district that had parts of the city and then parts of it that were in the suburbs. And, Biden had played really a bit part, is how I would describe it, in some desegregation protests in Wilmington, desegregating a movie theater, a restaurant, but it wasn't the center of his life. And he gets to Congress, but he'd been on that side of civil rights when he ran for office. He gets to Congress, and there was a sort of a fateful day when he went to a meeting with white suburban parents, and they took him to task for what they believed was his wrong position on court-ordered busing. They didn't want him to support it. And he became their champion, really, in the Senate. He adopted that view. He became an opponent, and that put him on the side of segregationists in Congress. And I think there are a lot of people who look back on that and they say, well, that showed me that there was a kind of absence of a core. What were his core beliefs? if he was willing to kind of move around on something like that. And, you know, there is two interesting outcomes, I think. One is, you heard on the debate stage that his response to that was, look, he kind of gave a technical response where he said, I was in favor of some kinds of busing and not this. And, you know, eventually, you know, that's where the issue ended up in the race, was this kind of technical discussion. But there was actually another moment that I find perhaps more revealing about I think some of his regrets, which is that on the anniversary of Selma, when he went down to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he was giving a speech, and he said, he kind of broke away from his prepared text. And he said, I am not supposed to say this, it's not in my speech, but I need to apologize that I wasn't here. I should have been here. And I wasn't here. And I'm sorry for that. And I think there's a piece of him that he could not have admitted that really years ago. He wasn't ready to. He didn't have I don't think he had the maturity. And you see that in him now at a different phase in his life.
Interesting, because it makes me kind of think about, like, what was it that inspired or that changed within him that made him ready to say that at that moment?
You know, I think if I had to really assign an explanation, I think one of the moments was the effect that serving with Barack Obama had on him. You know, there's David Axelrod told me an interesting story about the fact that, you know, because Axe was one of the people who was vetting Biden in the final weeks of the 2008 campaign. And Biden was still at that point, having lost the race, was still saying, look, I think I could have won this. I think I'm the best man for the job. But he came into the vice presidency and he still had a bit of a chip on his shoulder about the idea that he could have been the president. And then after a few months in office, working alongside President Obama at this moment of incredible complexity, you have a recession in the deepest throes already, and the president is contending with all of the challenges that he was facing. And Biden watched the way in which Obama, the sort of seriousness with which he responded to this, the level of technical rigor that he brought to it, the way that he was being careful about what he said, measuring his remarks in ways because he knew the impact would be so significant. And he said to David Axelrod after a few months, look, the truth is the best man won, and I am honored to be serving him and trying to help him succeed. So I do think there was, as somebody else said to me who worked in the White House in that period, that part of the key of that relationship, the President Obama, Vice President Biden relationship, is that one thought that he was the mentor of the other. And that was essential to that partnership. I think there's some real truth to that.
How do you think a Biden administration will be different from the Obama administration?
In a lot of ways, I think. I think they're coming at it, just to begin with, the circumstances are different. I mean, they are profoundly different. They are, even now, we're facing an economic crisis that's more severe. We're obviously still in the grip of the COVID epidemic. And I almost feel like we could use our time today by simply talking about that. I mean, it's such an all-consuming crisis for us as a people, as a culture, and as a political system, that it's going to be the defining fact of his presidency in the beginning. And so that's going to be a level of challenge that will define and constrain to some degree what he can do. He's also, of course, coming in without the support of a Democratic Senate, most likely. It's possible it could go the other way in Georgia, but assuming it doesn't, that will constrain what he can do in the first couple of years. And then there's another piece of it, which is the fact that it's an even more polarized environment today than it was when President Obama came in 2009. And I look back on the fact that President Obama was also capable of galvanizing this extraordinary coalition of people across the country. There were Republicans who voted for him. He had this ability to summon from us this belief in this transcendent idea of unity. And interestingly, Biden and Obama they're in agreement on the fact that unity is worth striving for. It's one of the things that pulls them together. One of their aides said to me at one point, that's the thing that ties these two very different men together, is they do believe that it is possible and worthy to aim for it. The difference is Biden doesn't use the power of the sort of power of inspiration in quite the same way. He is a more, I would call him a kind of more sort of practical politician. He believes basically that you can meet at the negotiation table and you can begin to talk about things in a way that might tie together these disparate interests. And that's the word he comes back to all the time, is interests, interests, interests. And I hear him talk about it when he imagines how he's going to deal with a Republican opposition, is I'm going to try to understand what their interests are and then find areas of agreement. It is different than the way, there's no question, President Obama believed that you had to have those kinds of practical discussions. But he did have this gift, this ability, both in his story, his personal biography, and in his powers of language and rhetoric, to be able to reach across those boundaries. And so they're coming at it with a different toolbox.
Obviously, Biden had lots of experience, years in the Senate. And you write about how, there were several times he came through for the Obama administration to pass the legislation by whipping votes in the Senate, both for the stimulus plan, the Affordable Care Act. And you write that he loved the old cloakroom deal making and people sort of trading on issues to arrive at some level of agreement, and including everything that you just said about, his interest in the other person's interest, basically, and kind of using that to work together. Is he going to be the unifying president that the country needs when it is so divided?
Look, it is extremely daunting what he is facing. I mean, just as a sheer political matter, he's contending with an electorate that just demonstrated that 70 million Americans cast votes for Donald Trump, knowing full well what they were getting. He's contending with a Republican Congress that has now refined the techniques of preventing a Democrat from succeeding. Mitch McConnell is still in the seat as of today. And Mitch McConnell, as we all know, believed from the very outset of the Obama administration that one of the paths to success was to prevent the Obama administration from notching any successes on the board. I will say, though, here's the reason why I have some small measure of optimism, and it's real, is that Biden and McConnell, they have some relationship. I don't want to overstate it. They're not going to be sitting on a porch swing holding hands. But the truth is, Mitch McConnell is the only Republican senator who came to the funeral for Beau Biden in 2015. He is the person, they've known each other for a very long time. There was that day in 2012 and 2011 when Mitch McConnell called up the White House, called Joe Biden's phone in his office and said, is there anybody over there who knows how to make a deal? They were facing the fiscal cliff crisis, and they ended up brokering an agreement which did avert a catastrophe, and it made a lot of Democrats unhappy. They felt Joe Biden had given away too much. But the true effect, the net effect, was the United States had averted a catastrophe. So I think you are likely to see these two find their way to some level of functional cooperation around matters of genuine urgency, like, for instance, a stimulus package to address the COVID crisis. But there's no question. I don't think that we have any illusion that Mitch McConnell and his caucus are going to wake up tomorrow and decide that the path to salvation is by helping Joe Biden succeed. And he knows that too.
Okay. I do want to get to some of the questions from our attendees. There are a few here. Here's a good one. I like this question. What, obviously you've covered him for some time. What was the most surprising thing that you learned when you were writing this book?
What really surprised me was that I interview a lot of people in politics. It's sort of, how I spend my days. And one of my, rough principles is that you generally discover that to be blunt about it, white male senators in their 8th decade are not generally the most reflective people in the world. They don't generally, talk about the mistakes they've made in their lives and so on. And actually, that's what Biden likes to talk about. He likes to acknowledge the ways in which he was wrong about things and the ways in which he thinks he has tried to change. And he's constantly on the lookout for things that he doesn't know, things that he doesn't feel like he has all of the information about. So, if he knows that you're a specialist in some area, he will grab you and talk to you for as long as his aides will allow until they drag him away to his next meeting. Joe Biden runs late for a lot of things. And part of the reason why he runs late is that he is constantly talking to whoever is available about what they know and he doesn't know. And I found that to be not incidentally important, but fundamentally important. I think it is a real measure of the degree to which he is coming into this office humbled a bit by his full life story, the highs and the lows. He has come to this with the recognition that he's been wrong about some things, and that makes him a stronger president, not a weaker president. And to state the obvious, that's a contrast that he's drawing with his predecessor here. And it's not insincere. So that surprised me because I was not accustomed to that necessarily. And I will mention, one of the interesting details is that it was another senator who mentioned it to me, Kirsten Gillibrand, who said that she said, look, one of the features of being in this, and by the way, I know I keep describing Biden as a senator, but that's part because that's sort of core to his identity. It's really how his mind works. And, I think it's important for all of us to think of him in those terms. But she said, one of the things you have to understand about the senatorial mindset is that most of the people who get to this job don't have any experience of vulnerability, of fragility, of what it means to be victimized by the fates, by the reality of the world, because that's by definition they've gotten there because they've had a series of successes in their lives. And she said it's very rare to run into somebody in this line of work who is actually really acutely aware of that kind of vulnerability. And I was struck by that, actually. It struck me as a big insight because he has been staggered in his life by misfortune and sometimes by his own mistakes. And I think that factors pretty deeply into his own view of the world.
Yeah, I was going to ask, if you think that is a result of having experienced, some of the tragic experiences that he has.
It's a reflection foremost of experiencing that tragedy, the loss of his wife, of course, the loss of his daughter, and then later the loss of his son. And then it's also a reflection of him recognizing the phases of his own life. I mean, there's a really interesting detail that for years after the 1987 race, you remember he dropped out in even before getting to 1988 because he'd had he'd taken words from a speech by Neil Kinnock in the UK, and there were a couple of other moments in the race. It was just a disastrous race. And it was years later, actually, that he was asked what happened in that race. And what he said was, I'll be honest with you, I was too arrogant for that race. I wasn't ready to be president. And there's a level of self-reflection that I think is essential to success in a way. And it's part of the reason I think why he is here, why he's reached the moment that he has reached at this phase in his life.
He had an aneurysm after that race. He almost died.
Yeah, I mean, go back.
Speaking of grief.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right. I mean, it's actually one of the reason I start the book with the story of the aneurysm, because we don't talk about it very much because it gets kind of overshadowed by the milestones of his political career. But it was a crisis that in any other life would be a defining milestone. I mean, he was so close to death that they called in a priest to deliver last rites, even before his wife could be by his side. And he clawed his way back. He was out of the Senate for 7 months and recovered fully and came back. And in his first speech coming back from the aneurysms, he said, I've been given a second chance in life. And I think that's a recurring pattern of Joe Biden's life, is that he has had these moments of extraordinary setback and then also these moments of great progress. And he said at the 2008 convention, when they were on the cusp of the nomination, he gave a speech in which he said that in life failure is inevitable, but giving up is unforgivable. And that's actually, I think, kind of the blinking red message at the top of his worldview, is that. And there's a deep meaning to that right now at this point in the country, where we are in so many ways suffering through this period and trying to figure out how we keep going forward. And he has some real experience with that. It's not an act.
On foreign policy, any insights? This is a question from one of our attendees. Insights into what his foreign policy priorities are going to be over the next 4 years, and if I can add on to that, with him being president, how does that change the worldview? How the U.S. looks to the rest of the world?
Well, his view is that, and I'll start from the broad position that I think fundamentally he puts a big emphasis on foreign affairs. It's one of the things that he has always taken a real interest in. He was obviously chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on 2 separate occasions. He's comfortable abroad. I mean, during the Obama presidency, Biden liked to joke that Obama would send him to the places he doesn't want to go. And there's some truth to that. I mean, I've been overseas with Biden on trips, and he is at home at the diplomatic table. That's just where he sees himself. And it's interesting to me, his view of if the question is, well, what will he do? I think he is confronting a set of circumstances that are different even than they were certainly when the Obama administration ended. To take one example that he and I have talked about in some detail is China. He is of the view, he comes from the generation that believed that the United States and China would succeed in effect mutually by encouraging one another's economic growth. They would serve complementary functions, and that the United States was going to be best served by helping China make its way into the world. We obviously supported their entry into the World Trade Organization. We structured deals in a way that would allow American businesses to go over there. And that view has been undermined over the last 10 years by a growing recognition on the part of, I think, American business leaders and also people who are interested in human rights, that it has not ushered China to the doorstep of democracy. On the contrary, in fact, we're seeing China coming into a phase of sort of a more rigid authoritarianism than we would have seen even 10 years ago before Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. So Biden is aware of the fact that not only does that mean that the United States has to change its relationship to China, it has to acknowledge that it's a fundamentally competitive relationship now, not a fundamentally cooperative relationship. I will, though, make a distinction with how he looks at it compared to the Trump administration. He does not come into this with the belief that we are on some civilizational conflict course. He thinks that kind of thinking is flawed. And he also believes that the Trump administration made a catastrophic mistake in its approach to China by trying to do things without the strength of our alliances. That the America First policy was, in many cases, America alone. As you see, he will go about trying to recalibrate this relationship, but he'll be doing it with Germany by his side, with Australia, Japan, South Korea, Canada, the full range of American alliances that are in so many ways our strength. That's likely to be one of his approaches. And I will just, we could talk about this particular subject all day, but I'll just add one other piece of it, which is that I think he believes that his mission from the very outset is going to be restoring American democratic credibility. He's concerned that we have lost some of that stature. You could call it a kind of moral glamour, which has been so important to America's interests. And he believes that we have hard work to do to recover that. What you heard him say in his victory speech earlier this month was that we lead by the power of our example. And that is important as far as he's concerned, as the example of our power. And from that perspective, there is some restoration that needs to be done before we can begin to try to pursue and project our interests into the world.
I'm going to combine these other two questions because we only have a few minutes left, and I think they're kind of related. So this question is, do you think Biden really wanted to run in 2020, or was it a selfless act because he felt that none of the alternate Democratic nominees or candidates could beat Trump? And from there, do you think he'll run again in 2024?
On the first question, I think it was a combination of what you could call a kind of moral imperative and then a blunt political imperative. The moral piece of this was he really did look at the trajectory of the Trump administration, and he decided it was an emergency. It was not just an ordinary case of a president he disagreed with. As he said to me, this man, I realized, was going to be so much worse than we thought he was. And so he felt summoned by that moment. I think if we're being completely honest here, there was a piece of a little bit of a personal element of I can show them. I was talked out of running in 2015 and 2016, and I have a hunch that I can beat this guy. And Joe Biden, to his very core, is a political animal, and he knows this. But I also think he looked at the field, and this is where it was actually a key strategic insight in some ways. He looked at the field of other candidates, and he thought to himself, I don't think they're reading the electorate correctly. He thought they are assuming that the electorate is more progressive than it is. He returns over and over to this piece of data, which I've heard him talk about, and others in his orbit have mentioned it to me a number of times, which is most Democrats today in 2020 still describe themselves as moderate or conservative Democrats. That may not be the case in 4 years. It may not be the case in 8 years. In fact, we do see the trend lines pointing towards a more progressive orientation. But that's not 2020. And it's not an accident that of the 27 Democrats who got into this race, that the one who was arguably one of the most conservative, certainly the oldest, ended up being the one who made it to the finish line. So he was right about that. 2024, I'm not being glib when I say I don't think he's decided. I can tell you with some confidence that his belief is that that the American public will make a judgment based on how he looks, how he sounds, how he behaves. He said it to me. Look, he is aware of the fact that he sometimes wishes that he had not encouraged his own father to retire. He thinks he did it prematurely. He thinks he could have worked more. And I think there's an element of Joe Biden who takes pride in the fact that he's a reasonably vigorous 77, and he wants to keep doing this job as long as he thinks he can do it well. One thing you can be sure of is that there are people around him, beginning with Jill Biden, his sister Val, who have what could be described as a sort of a clarity of message with him. And if they decide that the moment has come, they will be two of the people who will be telling him that that moment has arrived. And neither one of them believes now that he's not up to the job.
Okay. And because we've got another minute, and because you brought it up, because I thought it was very interesting as I was reading it in the book, you mentioned that he was sort of talked out of running in 2016. That was a very awkward dynamic between him and Hillary Clinton, with whom he has been friends, and the president that both of them served. And history is written, it was obviously decided that it would be Hillary Clinton to make the run. Tell us in the little bit of time that we have left about, kind of how that all went down.
It's a really fascinating piece of history. It's the kind of thing actually that lends itself to some great playwright should write a play with, 3 actors, right? If from Steppenwolf is watching, here's an idea for you. I do think there is.
I got a play for you.
Exactly. But if you think about it, it was just an extraordinary moment. I mean, Beau Biden had died, and that had really knocked the wind out of Joe Biden. And his friend, and they really were friends by this point, Barack Obama said to him, I'm worried about you running, not only because you're grieving, but also because I think if you don't win, it's going to be an unhappy, an embarrassing end to a distinguished career in public service. I know that President Obama was also concerned that it might split the party, that you would end up as a weaker Democratic field against whoever the Republican was going to be. And at that point, they were beginning to realize it was probably Donald Trump. And then the third piece of it was, look, President Obama, I think, believed that Hillary Clinton she too was going to be a history-making president. And he saw there was a natural air in that trajectory, and the idea that the first woman president would come into office. So there were a lot of reasons why he felt that way. He disagreed. Look, Biden and his advisors had done their own survey work. They thought that he was a stronger candidate than the president thought he was. They showed there was data that suggested that he had lower unfavorabilities in key states, in swing states. He was more popular than Secretary Clinton. And in the end, though, interestingly, it was actually, I think, the grief that held him back. There was a moment when his great strategist, very close advisor, Mike Donnellan, who has been with him right up to the present day, looked at his face. They were at the vice president's house, and Mike Donnellan looked at the kind of anguish that was still etched on Joe Biden's face and said, "Don't do this. You can't do this. Don't run. It's not the right moment." And they got up, and they were so close, they'd already drafted his announcement speech. Biden agreed with him. They got up the next day, they went to the Rose Garden, and Biden gave that speech with President Obama by his side and Jill Biden with him. And he said, "This is not the year." And you know what I find fascinating, Brandis? There's a prescient moment in that speech when he said, "This is not the time, this is not the year. I will continue to keep an eye on politics." But the prescient moment was he said, "What I ask of you, I beseech you, in effect, is please do not allow this encompassing sense of division to drive us further apart, because it will imperil this country. And I can't imagine that we can spend the next 4 years being even more divided than we are today, because it will be dangerous for us." And I think that analysis, of course, was right. And it laid the foundation for this campaign, which he ended up running in the name of unity, which is as much an aspiration, I think, as anything else.
Okay, that's a good place to leave it. 2020 has been a lot of things, but it has also been, clearly, it has been Joe Biden's year. So this has been fun, Evan. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you to everyone who tuned in live via Zoom. As a reminder, a recording of this conversation will also be available on the council's social channels and website shortly. Again, thank you, Evan, for joining us this afternoon. Pleasure speaking with you. I look forward to the next time.
I'll be seeing you again soon, I hope. Take care.
Yes. Take care. Bye.